Hello, and welcome to the Freed Black Girl Podcast. This show is a guide to self liberation, pulling the curtain back on healing through the power of storytelling. This show is dedicated to any and everyone doing the work to free their inner child, and for those with a desire and not quite knowing where to begin. My name is Najma Ahmed, and I am the host and creator of the Freed Black Girl podcast. I'll take you on my own journey to liberating the little black girl in me. Thank you for coming along on this ride to our collective freedom. Because as Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody's free until everybody's free. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Freed Black Girl podcast entitled Freed Spirit. I feed dead people. I will get into the meaning behind the title a bit more later on in the episode, but I just wanted to spend some time in this opening space to provide some context around how during my healing journey that I've been talking about throughout this podcast. And if you haven't listened to the first few episodes of the podcast, I encourage you to go back and listen to them because they're designed to really build upon each other and illustrate my healing journey and how at each step I was unable to unlock a little bit more of myself. And in this episode, I talk about how central my spirituality became to my healing. I think looking back, at the moment, I don't think that I was anticipating that that would be a part or such a huge part of my healing. I was thinking, healing past traumas, healing current stressors, things that I was going through in the workplace, and things around generally, being a Black woman in the world, in America in particular. But I, as I was, one story actually that I want to share was um, when Beyonce's album came out, the Renaissance album. And I remember my therapist actually texting me, or I was texting her something, I don't remember, but sent me a message and said that I should listen to the song Church Girl. And that song, and I had already listened to it probably about 7 times by the time my therapist suggested that I should listen to it the morning after the album had dropped. But that song embodied so much of where I was at in that particular time, the things that I was unpacking around how my upbringing, particularly being raised Muslim, but also spending a great deal of time in the church and Baptist church with the other side of my family, with my grandparents, with my aunt, and how those experiences really shaped the way that I moved through the world, the way that I carried myself, particularly when thinking about growing up Muslim, the quote unquote modesty that we are taught as girls, how we have to cover our body and kind of safeguard our purity at all costs. That was kind of central to growing up, that I had to stay perfect, that I had to stay, pristine, that I couldn't step out of line, and that, it was my responsibility to conduct myself in a way that didn't provoke the attention of men, right? And so at a very early age, that being that hyper focused on my body and the responses that it elicited from men, or not even being able to, when you go into the mosque, look at men in the eye, like having to kind of look down as you're walking in. And I know, we've heard about these things in Islam and how sometimes the women can be treated in a subservient role, but it's not limited to Islam. Even, when we think about Christianity, very similar. The control over the way, particularly that women show up, that women express themselves and their femininity, and always under the gaze of men, and making sure that we are not only controlling ourselves, but that we're also taking into account how we can make sure the onus was put on the women to control not only ourselves, but then the accountability for how men showed up was also placed on the woman. And so those things were so um deeply entrenched in me because consciously I rejected them. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I'm not buying into this. Um, you know, Growing up after my mother passed and I lived with my father briefly, he was more um let's say traditional when it comes to Islam and his beliefs. My mother was more liberal. She didn't cover necessarily unless we were going to the mosque. I wasn't required to, cover up or wear a hijab or anything like that. But when I, lived with my father, it was his expectation for a point there that I did cover up and that I did wear a scarf to school and things like that. But at that time, I was 14 years old. I had, gone through school to that point without that. I already walked in with an Arabic name. I was one of very few people of color in the school, Black kids in the school that I was in at the time. And the majority of the schools that I went to, me and my brothers were the majority of the Black students in the school a lot of the times. And so it was like I was already walking in, I was already different. My last name started with an A. So at the beginning of school, when the teacher was, calling the roll, my name was usually the very top of the list, and I could just see the struggle in their eyes. And I'm just like, it's me. And so I was always othered. I was always different. I was always believing in things that the majority of people around me did not believe. And so looking back, I see how much subconsciously that even if I wasn't necessarily buying into everything in the dogma consciously, that subconsciously it was carving these neural pathways in my brain that told me that I was different, that told me that I was other. And it, sets up your nervous system to then be on alert. And so whether or not, in my adulthood, I was subscribing to the same, organized religion and practices and things that I had learned, those things were still in me. Those things had still shaped me. Those things had still, carved those neural pathways in my brain, whether I liked it or not. And so in my healing journey, as I was healing my mind, healing my body, becoming more comfortable in my body, really starting to investigate where did this shame come from, religion became more prevalent, as I said, in my healing journey. And I'll talk more about kind of what my philosophy is around religion when I welcome in the guests later on. But I really was in this space where I had rejected organized religion, that I really just I had my relationship with God. I talked to God all the time. I'd even been in spaces though with friends who had known me for a really long time and had assumed that I was just atheist because I wasn't Christian. And it was like, okay, there's nothing in the middle. And again, these are things that I've carried with me that I always knew that I was on the outside. And so when I started to investigate, what was sustaining me though, when I talk about my own personal relationship with God, was that even though others thought I was different or other, I always felt that I knew that God was pleased with me and with what I was doing in the world, and that I knew that as long as I was trying to um, be a good person, and that as long as I was working for kind of our collective greater good, then that was really, I believed, and that was from the lessons that I got from Islam, right? That charity was one of the biggest pillars, one of the five pillars of Islam. Is centered around charity and service to others. When you think about Christianity, you think about Jesus, right? And Jesus as the person, and Islam sees Jesus actually as a prophet, in case you all didn't know that, but always, thought that those works and those teachings, I could understand the parables of them and the messaging of them and the strength that can be drawn outside of the manipulation that's seen in all religion, right? That religion can be used that way because man is man, and oftentimes it is, that person whose lens we are seeing religion through. And so I got to the space where I wanted to see God through my own lens. I wanted to talk to God through my own voice, not filtered through someone else and their own stuff. And so that was what really had sustained me, because I saw in my darkest times when, I'm listening to Smokey Norfolk, I Need You Now. Like, I still love gospel music, that song, or Grateful, or any of those old school gospel songs that we all, or a lot of us know, that was still sustaining me. And so there was never a question in my mind about the power of God, the power of spirituality, and the power of that connection to a higher power and source. And again, that is for me. Everyone may not feel that way. And that's the other reason why I was a little nervous to do this episode, but I was excited to do this episode because religion is such a taboo topic. It's so sensitive because it's so personal, and it's really something that we hold to our hearts, that we really cherish, but there's also so much shame around religion, particularly if you don't practice a religion in a way that other people have deemed to be valuable, that have deemed to be correct, that other people have deemed to be safe. And so I wanted to do this episode because I feel like we're at this point in time, particularly if you are healing, where the kind of old ways of operating and connecting with spirit are not the ways that a lot of people are finding that resonate with them right now. That we are looking more to nature, that we are remembering indigenous ways of being before colonization, before things started getting translated through texts, and before agenda started being infused in religion. A lot of people, particularly millennials, Gen Z, are really looking to other kind of sources, other pathways to connect with spirit. And I wanted to, I'm not going to talk a ton before we get into the full episode, because I really want you all just to hear the conversation with the expert and the guest that I have on today. But what I wanted to do to kind of set the context for this conversation, I'm going to play clips from a few Black women luminaries who most of us know and love, and hear them talking about their relationship to spirituality, but in particular, their relationship to the ancestors. And so I'll play clips from Alice Walker, Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, and Toni Morrison. And these clips that I will play for you all, they are clips that I saw while I was on my healing journey. Well, I still am, but while I was in this particular space in my healing journey, before I had started to actively learn more about connections to the ancestors. And so and I talk more about this later in the episode, but in my healing work with my therapist, she always talks about generational healing, the ability to heal ourselves by healing our stories, healing our ancestors, essentially by healing ourselves. And as she said it, I would think about it in the sense of, when we hear they're always with us when someone passes away, that, they're looking down on us, kind of like in almost like a euphemism. And so she would say it, and I'm like, yeah, 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 yeah. Like my mom is looking down on me, my grandma, grandpa, aunties, uncles, they're all looking down on me. And I believe that, but I didn't believe it in like an active since I think I felt it in more, like I said, like a kind of a ceremonial kind of feeling, like, yeah, they're, whatever that means. It's a thing that people say. But I wasn't necessarily believing it. Now that I look back on it in the way that I believe it now, in the active way. And I could tell you all some stories. This it and this is why it's so sensitive, because uh, part of me feels like if anybody knew, or if a lot of people knew the stories that I have about how the ancestors have interceded on my behalf in the time since I have been actively connecting with the ancestors, since I've been learning about ancestor reverence and how to really call on them, how to actively manifest. It was these Black women that I love and respect. Like I said, Toni Morrison, Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, these brilliant minds, these luminaries. And each one of them were talking about the ancestors in a very similar way, that there was this power that we were essentially leaving on the table, that this untapped source of connection for us was out there, and that we were so afraid of it because of our education, because of colonization, because of all of these things that have told us that having this connection is evil. But when you look at civilizations, countries, cultures around the world, this is not a phenomenon. Ancestral reverence is seen in almost every culture that you look at. And it is that connectivity that we see, that we're all very much more similar than we think. And that takes away some of the fear a bit when we realize that this is not something that is just isolated to one group, but this is something that has sustained people for centuries. And even beyond that, I think that, people conflate religion with ancestor reverence, and they feel like, well, if I'm Christian, if I'm Muslim, if I'm, Jewish, et cetera, Hindi, all of these religions, then I can't, you know learn anything else about ancestor reverence. I can just, you know I worship who I worship in my religion, and I completely understand that. But this is not an either or proposition. And I talk a little bit later in the episode about Jesus was an ancestor, right? Moses was an ancestor. Like these people, Muhammad was an ancestor. And so when you start to ask yourself, why do you feel comfortable revering those ancestors and not your great grandma and not your great grandfather? What is it that has told you that it is okay to, believe in these other things, in these organized religions, and these texts from centuries and centuries and centuries ago, but the person the person such as your grandmother, who literally held you in her womb as she held your mother in hers, that once that person passes away, that you feel like you no longer have any connection with her at all. But we can pray to Muhammad, we can pray to Jesus, we can invoke Buddha, et cetera, and et cetera, so on and so forth. But those people with that direct connection to us, we feel like there's no power there. And so we have to start asking ourselves those questions and really getting curious about, well, what have I been told and who told it to me? What am I internalizing that is now blocking me from really being open? I thought all of this was weird. Like, I thought all of this was weird, or I told myself I thought all of this was weird. I don't think that I really did, because again, growing up, I was always on the periphery. My beliefs, my practices, everything was different already. So this was a little bit easier for me to really kind of think outside the box. It's like, sure, yeah, this sounds right, and kind of go with it. But I will um next really just want you to listen to these clips and really sit with them. Really feel what comes up for you when you hear them. When I heard them, it felt like alarm bells started to go off in my body. It was like, wait a minute, what? What are they saying right now? And really that's what launched kind of my research into how can we actively be in touch with our ancestors. And it has changed my life in ways that are unimaginable. And I'm so grateful for the connection, for the love, for the support that I now have in my life, that I want all of you to have. And so that's why I'm doing this episode. I feel like the ancestors are calling to us. I feel like we're in a time of great change and evolution in this time in humanity, period. And it's being we're being called to operate in ways that we have never thought possible, and to operate under new kind of technologies and spiritualities where, yes, you can be free to express your spirituality in any way that resonates with you. And we're moving away from this strict that feeling that something so personal, such as the way that you talk to God, can be dictated by anybody else. And so, if nothing else, that is what I want for you to get out of this episode, is that the way that you talk to God cannot be dictated by anybody else. And to feel strong in that, to feel confident in that, and to feel supported in that. So take a listen to these clips from these brilliant women. And then after that, I will introduce our guest, who I am so grateful to have on. And then we'll jump into the rest of the interview.
You have to know that at any given point, who's with you, who wanted you to live. And I'm always knowing that my grandmother and her friends have always wanted me to do well. So I never have to worry. I mean, I can go to Chatham Hall and talk about slavery. I can do anything I want to do, actually, because I always know that there are some people that are always going to be very proud of my effort.
Ancestors are the benevolent, guiding spirits that we are and can be constantly in touch with.
Do you believe in that? Do you believe that ancestors that you have not known can be still coming through us, working through us, and we retain some memory
I do now.
of them? You do now?
I do now. My whole education, was to make sure I didn't believe things like that. And I dismissed all sorts of things that were indigenous in my family, superstition and the discredited information, the discredited way of knowing that discredited people always have. But when I began to write, that was the place where I had to go. That's where the information was. That's where the images were. That's where the language, the color came in these tales, folk tales, attitudes, the normal, easy acceptance of signs. And then things began to happen.
Bring your people with you. Bring everybody who has loved you with you. Say, Grandma, come on, let's go. Great-grandpa, you've been dead all this time. Come on, let's go. I have to go in here and have an interview. Come on, Auntie. Come on, my friends, come, let's go. And when you walk in, people don't know what it is about you. They can't take their eyes off you. You may not be cute in the given sense. You may not be fashion model size in that particular sense. You may not be any of those things, but they can't take their eyes off you. And they say of you,
we are walking around on the earth that is actually literally full of ancestors, and we never pay any attention to this fact. I mean, most people don't. It is as if all of the indigenous knowledge, all of the indigenous wisdom, all of the indigenous everything is just something that we completely discredit as if it never existed. And this is a deep impoverishment of us as modern people. That's why we walk around looking like we're zombies.
Our guest expert, Verona Spence Adofo, is a spiritual consultant, educator, researcher, filmmaker, and writer. She is the co-founder of Ancestral Voices. Ancestral Voices is an educational initiative spanning over a decade with the sole purpose of documenting and disseminating research-based knowledge about African sacred cosmologies, their spiritual philosophies and practices. Over the past 14 years, she has accumulated a wealth of spiritual and healing wisdom from working with different healers, medicine people, and scholars across the globe, deepening her own spiritual understanding and cultivating her gifts to assist others. All right. Hello, Verona. I am so excited to welcome you to the Freed Black Girl podcast. I have been following your work for such a long time, and it's had a deep impact on my own healing journey. So I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you, Najma. I'm truly honored to be here, and I appreciate the invite, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. So, I first just wanted to offer to the listeners kind of a recap a little bit of our last few episodes, because as you know, and if you've been following the podcast, each episode is really meant and designed to build upon each other. And so we had our first episode around freed mind and my work around somatic healing and really understanding where I was coming from with childhood trauma and learning to unpack that. We went into the freed body episode where we talked about the impact of stress and holding trauma in our body, what that can do, and those physical symptoms that can present themselves, and how I was able to work with holistic practitioners, my Reiki practitioner, but also looking at the nexus between the quote unquote woo woo and science, and knowing that there's so many healing modalities out there for us that can help us on our healing journeys. And then we had kind of a special 2-part episode where I shared more about how on my healing journey, a key part was really connecting to my story. As we talked about in the freed body episode, it's so important not only for us physically to know our stories, what, our parents passed down from generations, if we had heart disease or addiction or high blood pressure, all those things. But then also it's important to understand their stories, because we not only get some of the ailments that are passed down from generation to generation, but there are also gifts. There are also superpowers that we inherit from generation to generation. And so in those 2 episodes where I talked about my great grandfather being an educator, being a preacher, being a leader in the community, my great grandmother as well, leading women's organizations, and then my grandmother, the story that I shared about her being a healer, being a nurse, but also being a conjure woman, being a woman who was interested in things like astral projection in the 1950s and 60s. And so understanding that as much as we inherit, like I said, those things that we don't necessarily talk about, or we talk about the traumas a lot, we also inherit a lot of gifts. And so that brings us to this episode, entitled Freed Spirit, and the tagline is I feed dead people. And so when we think about spirituality, it can be a really sensitive topic. And so this was actually one of my more nerve-wracking episodes that I'm doing when I wanted to put it out, because it's such a personal experience when we talk about spirituality, what we believe in, our higher power, if we don't believe in anything at all. And I've talked about, if you follow my Instagram page, and if you don't, you should definitely go do that right now, the Freed Black Girl. But I talk about on there my own background, being born and raised Muslim, in a family that everyone else was Christian, but both of my parents converted to Islam back in the 70s, as many Black Americans did. So that was a part of my foundational formation. But then also in the summers, I spent almost when I was with my grandparents, spent almost every day at church, Baptist church. My aunt was a church clerk. I was the person standing outside the church putting up the little bulletins with the letters on the sign. And so I had that mixture as well. But also growing up, I was in African youth groups where I was learning Swahili. I was learning about different African traditional practices. And so I grew up in kind of like this stew of spirituality. And then I got to a point when I was growing up, and we know about trauma. And when my mother passed, I actually was at my African step class the night before this happened. And so everything that I kind of had been holding on to as far as religion was concerned, I was always questioning religion. I was always asking questions. I would be at church and I would be like, so you say Jesus is God, but also the Son, but also the Spirit. And so how does that work if Jesus is themselves? And they would be like, just stop asking questions. You have faith, right? And so I was like, okay. And even in Islam, a lot of the things that we learned were very powerful about how the women were supposed to be venerated. But then in practice, we saw this subservient role that men were saying that women needed to play sometimes in the religion. And so that was always odd to me, like, somebody's lying, because I read that this said that women were revered. And so even as a kid, I always kind of just questioned organized religion, traditional spirituality, but I always had a close connection with God. I would even in college, I after my mother passed, we moved closer to my grandparents, and so really wasn't at the mosque anymore. And a lot of my spiritual tradition was now rooted in Christianity. It was a little awkward. I would be sitting there on first Sundays, and they would be passing around communion, and it freaked me out because they were like the flesh and the blood, and I was like, what's happening? No, and not knowing it was grape juice as a kid and crackers, but those rituals that were unfamiliar to me. And so as I grew and got older, I kind of picked pieces of the religion that sustained me in my own journey. With Islam, I love the meditative practices. I still say Al Fatiha when I get on an airplane. I still kind of recite different prayers that bring me calm from my childhood and kind of calm my nervous system. From Christianity, I love gospel music until the homophobia jumps out randomly sometimes. But I still pull those pieces. And I also know that after my mother passed and I was going to church, that was one of the spaces where I had community, where I could find kind of like that solace and sit and just talk to God one on one. And so I've always had that relationship with spirit. But I started to kind of move away from organized religion. I basically was telling myself I wanted to cut out the middleman. Like, I just want to go straight to the source. I used to tell people, like, my religion is I want to be a good person, do right by other people, help other people, and hope in the end that it all worked out. That's basically what my practice was. But when I started to heal, I did start to notice that I missed having something that I could better articulate as my kind of guiding light my guiding support system, my community, my spiritual community. And then I came across this book called The Ancestor Connection, and it really laid out like what is ancestor veneration throughout time, throughout cultures, that this is something that is practiced around the world, paying respect and homage to our ancestors, but also showing them gratitude, also calling on them in times of need, in manifestation. And so much of it resonated with me about things that I knew that I had been called to do that I didn't know why. It's my intuition, but it felt deeper than that. That I was carried through sometimes, that I'm like, how, who, who just picked me up and just drifted me to this space of safety. And so I say all of that to say, I know that was a lot. I would love to hear from you why you started Ancestral Voices, even if you want to share just some about your story as well. And then just more broadly, I just want the listeners to understand, what is ancestor veneration? What is it? Does this mean that now I worship the ancestors and I can't worship, I can't have my own religion or anything like that? Or just explain more about what that is.
All right. So go back to the first one. So what did you ask me? So what is Ancestral Voices? Okay. So Ancestral Voices is an educational initiative set up by myself and my husband, Dalian. We've been documenting and researching African spiritual philosophies now for 14 years. And it was literally born out of our own personal journey. So you've just explained your journey and kind of what led you down this path. And we've had separate journeys. So with him, he's born in Ghana, raised in sort of a Catholic household, you know, being kind of very much in the sort of Catholic world, but still, I guess, being culturally, there may be certain things he was exposed to, but very much in a religious framework. For myself, I grew up in a Jamaican household where my parents, well, my mum was definitely religious. I grew up with the whole kind of like white Jesus iconography on the wall, but I didn't actually go to church growing up as a child. So that meant that I was very kind of questioning. So like yourself, many of the questions I was like, how you Jesus the Son all at the same time, the Father, the Son. Like it to me that was confusing. And the same, you asked questions, people would cry to like, don't worry about that. So growing up, I kind of from a young age, I didn't resonate with that because I just thought this is not for me. I'm not feeling it. And so I spent a lot of my childhood or kind of early teenage years being atheist. I just didn't believe in anything. So I was just like, nothing captured my spirit until I started getting into, I guess, what we would call these days new age spiritual teachings. And I was like,
Mhm.
wow, this is kind of interesting. Like the stuff that they're saying is resonating. But at the same time, I remember even being conscious then that mm, it's like, but where are they getting this information from? Like, who are the people that they're getting this ancient wisdom from? So I knew it was ancient.
Exactly. Mhm.
And so by the time, and this was years ago. So by the time I met who would become my husband, Dalian, when we met each other, he was at a stage in his journey where he was practicing ancestral reverence. And I was like, wow, I was amazed because by that point, I'd already started to kind of question, like where are these new age people getting their information from? So I started kind of going back into learning about ancestors and things like that. And so when he was already actively implementing ritual in his life, I was just so blown away because up until that point, I didn't meet anyone else who was having this similar journey to me.
Mhm.
Anytime I would speak to like friends or family, they would look at me like I was weird. Like, why are you even thinking about this?
Yeah.
So I just kind of thought, all right, maybe I'm just going to walk this journey on my own. And so meeting him, it was like, okay, cool. This is two of us having this experience. We're learning from these African spiritual teachings and finding them empowering. So we thought, why not put our skill set together? He's a qualified teacher.
Mhm.
I've got a media background. He also has media experience as well. So then this is how we ended up creating our first documentary. And that is literally how Ancestral Voices was born. So we thought, we've come into information that shows that this is not this spooky, scary, demonic thing that people try to make
Right.
out it to be. And so we were like, cool, let's just put this information out there and make it accessible to people and start breaking down these stigmas that surround the topic. So that's literally how Ancestral Voices was born.
Wow, and now it's grown to be, what do you all have? A community over 170,000 people or something like that?
Um, yeah, it's yeah. So I don't know. There's like about 146 on Instagram, K, and then I think Facebook's like 350K or
Oh,
so.
wow,
So
okay.
it's like, yeah, we've been doing this work for a long time, and so
Mhm.
it started off with us literally using a family holiday to Ghana to film our first
Mm.
documentary, and then from there we ended up producing, sorry, a second film, books, courses, interviews. It's really expanded since.
Wow, and so have you seen, I'm curious, over the years, have you seen interest start to, increase more and more, and does it feel like it was concentrated any period of time when you felt like, "Oh, wow, this is kind of growing a lot?"
Um, yeah, because when we first started, so then we're going back to 2010 now, and I can say honestly that the subject of African spirituality was very still like hidden only in certain circles and spaces. Yeah, we've definitely seen an increase. Like it's fascinating to see that when we first started this journey, it was like few and far between. Obviously, there were people obviously talking about it, but now it's like everywhere. And
Mhm.
not just on social media, but even like in mainstream culture, like you have TV shows where some of the characters are practitioners of African spiritual traditions and things like that. And this was not happening before at all. So I do really appreciate how now it's become more of mainstream society. So
Mhm.
it takes away the stigma of somebody being a practitioner and things like that. The flip side, though, is it means that it's opened up this whole spiritual arena for opportunists. So
Mhm.
particularly on social media, people claiming to be babalaos and in your inbox and all of these things,
Yeah.
offering
Yeah.
reading. It's a duality with everything in life, to be fair, but
Right.
it's to me it's overdue. I think it's necessary. I think we should never disregard the whole concept of just even planting a seed, because even
Mhm.
us, by sharing some of this information, putting this post out there, people are reading it and thinking, oh wow,
Right.
and I wish that I had like an Ancestral Voices platform when
Yeah.
I was starting, because I was clueless,
Yeah.
and I was like, how did I get this far in my life and not know about all of
Mhm.
this stuff? But
Absolutely.
everything
Absolutely.
happens in its divine time.
And that's what I was saying too when I did read, the book, The Ancestor Connection, and so I shared this book with her, and then I went into a session and I was nervous. I'm like, she's gonna think I'm insane because I'm talking about how I feel this connection with these spirits. And, typically in Western psychology, they would be like, okay, maybe we need to go deeper if you're talking to, your grandmother who died before you were born, right? And so I was so appreciative to have this space with this Black woman, therapist, to be able to help me to process. And so I went into the office and I was just like, I want to, from now on, do my therapy through the lens of spirituality and the ancestors. And she just said, okay. And I was like,
Wow.
you know any more information than that? And ever since then, she just intuitively knew what I meant. And so I can go into a session and be like, X, Y, and Z happened. Like that was the ancestors. And I feel like, whatever. And we'll talk about it. And we'll talk about how I can connect with them. And so that was a blessing, right? That was the ancestors bringing these people into my life. The other episode of Free Body with my Reiki practitioner, who's also my chiropractor. They also are connected to my therapist. So it's like all of these little connections that have happened. And so I would love for you just to share, if you could, for the listeners, because there are, like you said, so many people out there who are trying to capitalize on other people, who are giving incorrect information. Can you just tell us, what is ancestor veneration? What is it?
Yeah, so ancestral veneration, because one of the things that they used to stigmatize us was, oh, they worship their ancestors. And the thing is that even if we think about it logically, so if they did, and what, like, why is
Mhm.
that such a big thing for us to be scared about? So let's break it down about the
I mean,
whole.
Jesus was an ancestor.
Exactly.
Muhammad was an ancestor. So
Nobody
yeah.
questions that.
Mhm.
But this is the thing. So if we break down ancestral reverence, we know already that we are the culmination of our ancestral genes. So, our mother, our father, our grandparents, our great grandparents on both sides. So they literally, their DNA, their genes, everything exists within us. We are the most recent incarnation of them, because we're the totality of what's come before us. So, through the practice of ancestral reverence, we are paying homage to that aspect that exists within ourselves. So, there's no separation, there's no spookism. If anything, to me, it's a form of like self empowerment. It's an ability to activate a certain part of yourself. So, when we understand that we are the collection of ancestors within us, then if you start calling upon your great grandmother, or for example, you can now start to activate that essence within you. So you had a great grandmother who was this, I don't know, entrepreneurial spirit, very creative mind, and you might have this project where you're stuck and you can't think creatively, and you're like, oh, let me call on my grandma or great grandma, sorry, and by you reverencing her and invoking that essence, which is still ultimately you can now start to tap into that ancestral memory. So for me, the whole concept of ancestors is acknowledging the line that comes before you. It's about understanding yourself not just as this physical vessel, but as the greater being that you are, because we are not just limited to this physical body. So ancestral reverence, as far as I'm concerned, is like a way to tap into your greatest self and to
Mhm.
realize that you are holistic being within yourself. And when we live in this kind of Western construct, we tend to just limit ourselves to our physical bodies and neglect our spiritual aspects, which is vast. And so the practice of ancestral reverence is a way for us to keep that divine connection always going. So you mentioned yourself that once you got into the practice of ancestral reverence, you started to realize that they'll communicate with you in various ways. And that's what will happen. So for people who think it's scary and they're going to get some big flash of lightning and
Yeah.
some scary ghost, to me, I find that it's a lot more subtle. It's the little coincidences that you may start to experience, or the animals or insects that you start noticing frequently, or whether it's number repetitions. A lot of people get that, definitely myself included. So
Mhm.
there's various different ways that they can communicate with us, and dreams is another one of those avenues. But the whole purpose of ancestral reverence is for us to kind of acknowledge that we are greater than this physical vessel, and that we can tap into that infinite memory that exists within us at any time.
Mhm. Thank you. And so there's so many things. You mentioned the animals. So, cardinal birds are mine. I see cardinals everywhere, and it's kind of a double thing. I'm from Ohio, and that's like the state bird is the cardinal, but then also cardinals are known to represent ancestors in spirit. And so I moved into a new house, and like every day there's just tons of cardinals. Yesterday I was sitting there and there was like monarch butterflies all through the yard. So I'm just always like, hey, hey, whoever that is. So how do you do it? How do you begin the process of ancestor reverence? When we were talking in the other episodes, I was saying one of the first steps is finding their names if you can, but also wanting people to understand that ancestors aren't just your bloodline that came before you. This, if you're adopted, for instance, this can be ancestors are the people who raised you. Also, it can be my organization for my job is called the Chisholm Group. It's named after Shirley Chisholm, and so it could be someone that you admire that has passed on. I have Toni Morrison behind me right now, right? And so, what can it look like when you want to start kind of
Well,
this practice?
so as you mentioned, ancestral reverence doesn't necessarily apply just to your own blood lineage. It can also apply to revered elders. To be honest, in a traditional sense, if we're looking at the word ancestor, it is actually for those who lived a life that is worthy of veneration, because as we know, there are
Mhm.
people who necessarily didn't live a good life. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that they should be disregarded or because they're still a part of us, but in terms of for the attributes that you want to, obtain within yourself, this is why you call upon the benevolent ancestors.
Mhm.
So in terms of deified ancestors, so these are people that were highly regarded, or as you said, whether you're adopted, people in your life who were good to you, somebody who they looked out for you, you can reverence them. Now, in
Mhm.
terms of ways to do it, there are so many different ways to revere your ancestors. And one of the things that I'm quite big on stressing is that we should always know that we're spirit, we're energy. So there
Mhm.
is literally no blockage, there's no stoppage. The only limitation are the ones that we put on ourselves. So when I first started doing ancestral reverence, I actually lit a candle. And one of the things that we do recommend is, if you do work with the elements, you can have the element of fire and water. They are good ways to kind of open that gateway for communication, but equally it's not necessarily. So just to complete that, you can light a candle, call upon their names if you know their names. If you don't know their names, then you can call upon those kind of elevated ancestors who you want their advice, their guidance, support, protection, whatever it may be.
Mhm.
However, as I mentioned, there's still no set rules. So as long as you even have the intention that you want to start connecting with your ancestors, you will find that your reality will start to shift and open up because you
Mhm.
put that out there. And so, even when I look back at my own journey, I can see that once I even started to question and get into this, the pathways opened up. As you mentioned, you start meeting the right people, they come into your,
Mhm.
the dreams start kicking in, or the visions, or you start overhearing conversations that are relevant to things that you've been discussing, and you'll find out that they will find ways to communicate with you to let you know that we are here, we are responding. So a lot of people may say, oh, but my ancestors are not talking to me.
Mhm.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's, we kind of need to attune our awareness to kind of pick up on what they're saying.
Yeah, I think too, as you were saying that, something that came to me was oftentimes I think I was interpreting it as anxiety sometimes because it was messages that were coming through that it was things that I was avoiding, things that I didn't want to deal with in that time. And it was like, oh, you should look at this, or, maybe you should stop doing this thing that is hurting you, or maybe you should stop talking to this person, right? It was these things that were coming in. And I was just kind of brushing them off to the side, or I wasn't present enough. That was the other piece, like how I feel like this got louder along my healing journey because I became more present. I became more aware when I was able to discern and differentiate between my anxiety and my intuition and which was which and how do I listen to either one. And so, to your point, when I did start to think about how I wanted to start to do this on purpose when I was in my healing and I was talking to my therapist and she was talking about, ancestral healing and the power of the ancestors. When I started to think that way, I was then able to get more curious to ask myself the question. So it was even that very first step to even say, oh, I want to heal some of my ancestral patterns. How do I do that? And then the very next thought was, this is how you do that, right? Go Google it, right? And then this book came up. And I'm like, oh, I'm gonna read this book. And then that book like changed my life. And I share it with so many people. So I don't know if that resonated for you at all. Like that.
100%,
Yeah.
definitely. And especially the point that you made that is very poignant point is how to discern between whether there's a message coming through or your own anxiety or paranoia. And you mentioned the key word is healing. And
Mhm.
so this has been like a key part of my journey, and literally learning to clear all the junk, all the stuff that we've kind of held on to. stuff that in most cases we don't even know it's there because we're just
Mhm.
kind of living our lives getting on with it. But it's only when we start to really tune into ourselves and have that level of internal reflection, then we can start seeing, oh, okay, I have some insecurities there, I've got
Mhm.
some old baggage from childhood there, and all of these things. And once you start to become aware of those things, it's not necessarily removing them completely, but for us to even get to a state where we can identify that there's something to address, then we're paying attention, we're observing ourselves. And in that state of being aware of self, then we can start to work on resolving those matters. And I always stress in my healing sessions is that the more we start to heal ourselves, the louder our intuition gets. Because it's
Mhm.
like we clear all the baggage, and now we're just left with that direct connection where everything is just a lot more quicker and a lot more in tune. So
Mhm.
definitely, and then once you do that, you will find that you can start receiving messages in so many different forms.
It's that flow of energy again that we talked about in the freed body episode, with Dr. Darian, really understanding that our bodies are like these circuits. And when we talked about, the chakras and things like that, where we have these blockages in our bodies because of trauma, because of stress, because of whatever else we have going on, it blocks that energy. And that includes our intuition and our natural ways of knowing that our ancestors have been trying to give to us. Like I've been telling people, like our ancestors want us to stop being afraid of them because they want to support us so that we can oftentimes live lives that they weren't able to. And so I'm interested if you can talk a bit more about we talked about, ancestor reverence and what that can look like, but in the more broad sense, something else that I started to study, Buddhism. I read a book called Black and Buddhist, Understanding Nature and that impact on our spirituality. But then, of course, started to study more about African traditional religions and African traditional cosmologies. And so, if you can as best as possible, because I know it's so deep and such a rich history. Share more just about what are African traditional cosmologies or religions. Um, yeah, we'll start there and then go.
Yeah, so that's definitely a big question because, as
Yeah.
we know, there are multiple different, communities that have
Hmm.
their own spiritual practices.
Right.
However, with the beauty of the research that we've been able to do over the past 14 years, what I have found truly beautiful and amazing is that, despite no matter where you are on the African continent, whether north, south, east, or west, or central Africa, there's like a clear framework that we can say that fits, which would be under the umbrella term of African spirituality or African sacred science, whatever term you wish to call it, African spiritual practices, that there are core themes. So let me start from, I'll say, the beginning. So this idea of like a supreme being, or this concept of creation. So this supreme being, what we know, what we would call in English God, is not like a person sitting in heaven or any concept like that. When you look at the African conception of the creator, we're talking about the totality of the universe, really. So we're talking about the all, there is no separation. It's like when you refer to the supreme, the totality of everything. When the cosmologies is represented as both male and female. So we're talking masculine and feminine principles of creation there. Yeah. So there's this concept of a supreme being, which is both masculine, comprises of both masculine and feminine energies. In some communities, it may be more referred to as the feminine side or some of the masculine side, but ultimately, and some in androgynous as well, but ultimately it represents everything. And so when we talk about the supreme being, we're talking about everything in creation. And so once we understand that you can't put a definition on everything. This is where we come up with a concept of nature forces, which is now you'll find that across the continent as well under various different names. So whether the Orisha or the Obossum or the Inkisi, they are the different divinities that we call that are attributes of the supreme. So because the supreme is so vast and is everything, to start to know and understand, this is where we start to break it down. So you start to look at the trees or the oceans or the rivers or the rain, the mountains, and all of those different attributes have their own characteristics and energies that they carry. So they're nature forces. So this can be simply the herbs that grow from the ground, the minerals, and all of these things, might I add, are all things that exist within ourselves. So when we look at this whole concept, the supreme as well, we are not separate. We are not separate from creation. We are not separate from this creator energy. That energy exists within us, the same energy that exists within the plants, the rivers, the ocean, and so forth. Then we have the concept of ancestors, which we discussed earlier. So, once again, the ancestors are a combination and collection of everything we just discussed. That's also within ourselves. Outside of ancestors, I'm just trying to break it down in my head.
No,
We have things like ritual practices. So, one of the main ritual practices that you'll find is this act of libation. So we're the act of pouring originally water. Now you may find things like alcohol or palm wine or milk. The act of pouring that liquid to the ground and making your prayers and intentions. And by the best way I would describe libation is ultimately picture how the rain falls down on the soil and fertilizes the soil. And it's like you plant your seed, you plant your intention into the soil, and from the watered liquid, your manifestation bursts. And so that just already shows the act of libation is a beautiful way to kind of show how we understand our relationship with the earth and understanding that there's no disconnect, but also showing how everything within creation works in harmony with each other. Okay, outside of that, so we have things like ritual ceremony, things that include dance, singing, ceremony. These are all crucial parts of African spiritual philosophies that you'll find across the continent. And these are all forms of invocation. So, as much as we may look at dance and think it's a recreational activity, within dance, dance is healing. Dance is allowing ourselves to open up to the spiritual realm. Dance is a way to invoke ancestors and to receive spiritual guidance. Music, the same. Music is a way to invoke those energies to kind of step into different dimensions through the vibrational frequency that's going out. We're able to now create a different space, or create a healing environment, or have a certain spaces set up for particular things. So when we do these kind of, whether it's a ritual dance, drumming, music, they are used at different times for different things. So ceremonies can be from birth, for marriage, for puberty years, everything. There is ceremony for death. And so everything in life is a ceremonial experience, and everything is acknowledged and recognized because it each plays a vital part in why we're here. So I've given a list there. That's just a few, but
Yeah.
these are kind of like the main points that we've come across that you will go across no matter where you are, whether on the African continent or there are adaptations that exist in a diaspora, and you will still
Mhm.
find these things.
Let me ask you, so that was exactly what was on my mind. So I love that you said that about the diaspora, because that sounds so much to me like it lives in other religious traditions in the diaspora. Even thinking about, right, like Christianity, particularly in Black churches, the importance of dance and praise dance, the importance of music, gospel music in Black Christianity and the Black church. Also thinking about the water aspect and holy water in Islam, making ablution and the cleansing with the water, or baptism in the water and those elements. And even with nature, and that they have importance as well in these other spiritual practices and traditions. And so how do we get to the point where, and I think I know how, but where we got to the point that these African traditions were deemed evil, and scary and bad, but when they live in other places, we look at all the rituals that exist in the Christian church. Like I said, the communion with the blood and the flesh, and you look at Bible stories, and it was a whole lot of magic happening in there with burning bushes and whales eating people and parting seas. And so all of those things are deemed, normal or acceptable. So I would love to hear from you. Yeah, how did the African traditions become evil and allow us to be so afraid of them?
Yeah. Well, this was definitely a systematic progress that's been going on for hundreds of years. So, it's taken a long process to get to this point. So, I guess one of the original things is, first of all, you disconnect people from their spiritual practices. So, things like the drum were banned in certain places. I don't know, for example, Jamaica, for example, they couldn't drum, they couldn't have their traditional practices. To this day, the Obia Act is still in place. There's an Obia Act in Jamaica, meaning you cannot, to this day, legally practice your spiritual tradition. So,
Mm,
by first of all separating people from their spiritual practices, you create that original disconnect, and then you can now start putting this narrative, oh, it's something bad, it's evil, and blah blah blah, and that becomes this kind of stigma that remains. Then we have to look at the fact that religious institutions have also played their part in stigmatizing these practices across the globe. Then we have to look at the fact that we've had the media also reinforce this. Often is look at Hollywood and things like that, and how they've kind of sensationalized things like voodoo and be
mm,
scared, like it's so evil, and zombies and all of these kind of things, that these narratives that are constantly put in our face. And then I would go as far as even down to educational institutions to this very day, still do not treat African spiritual traditions in the same way as they would talk about Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so forth. So this has been an ongoing thing. And unless people actively stand up and say, no, this is not correct, then we can see how it will just continue. One of the main features as well that has been prevalent is the language that is used. So you
mm,
said, how can it be acceptable in Christianity, and all the different practices that they have there, which is cannibalism really in a ritual form,
mhm.
but nobody questions it.
Yeah.
Whereas, when we start looking at the way language has been used to stigmatize African spiritual practices, we have things, a traditional healer, for example, is labeled a witch doctor, and
Mhm,
like that. Like, why are they a witch doctor?
mhm.
When they doing certain offerings and things, it's a sacrifice. Nobody actually refers to the death of Jesus in the Bible as a sacrifice, really, because that's a human sacrifice right there. But nobody, once again, really questions it. So we have to really look at how it's been on multiple angles. And then coupled in with the whole stigmatization of Africa in general as, oh, it's backward, this stuff is evil, it's
Mhm.
primitive. All those kind of words are used in a way to diminish and tell us, oh, this is something that they did in the past. This is something that you're not supposed to go near now. Like, oh, we've evolved now. Like, we don't need that stuff. And there's many people who have internalized that and still believe that to this day.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I think we have to really look at is, why did they
Yes.
go out of their way to stigmatize it like this?
Mhm.
So, one of the things that has been abundantly clear is that our spiritual practices are a means to empower us. It means that once you kind of tap into your spiritual self and who you know who you are, there are certain things that can't happen. There's certain things that will literally change vibrationally in terms of your existence and your reality. So to keep people down, you have to make them feel unworthy, you have to make them feel inferior, and all of these other things, so they eats away at their own character, so they don't even start to try or believe that they have any form of power. So when we start looking historically now, and then, for example, one of the greatest examples is the Haitian Revolution, where we saw that it was originally incited by a ritual carried out by Boukman Dati and Cecile Fatiman at the Bois Cayman ritual that they did that led to the Haitian Revolution. So they actually used a voodoo ceremony to actually launch, get everybody ready, invoke the energies to go and get prepared for war. And eventually they won and were successful. There's also the Maroons, Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica. She's an Akan, gone to Jamaica. So she has her knowledge from Africa mixed in with the indigenous spiritual traditions there that we would now call Obia. And so, it's well known that she had her spiritual knowledge and she used her spiritual knowledge that when training up her warriors, she would also have them protected spiritually as well. So they were ready to go and fight. There's
Mhm.
also another example of this being used in the African continent in Zimbabwe, known as the Second Matabele War. And this was something also initiated by the spiritual leaders there against the British, who were there taking up all the land and the resources.
Mhm.
And they were like, no, this is not going to happen. So, once again, the spiritual leaders were very instrumental in galvanizing communities and also having various prophecies to say that you will be successful in this, so keep going.
Mhm.
So our
Mhm.
spiritual power, our spiritual knowledge, our spiritual wisdom, when we tap into it, there is literally nothing that we can't do. um,
Mhm.
but that fear, to get over the fear, to get over the programming of not feeling good enough or feeling inferior, that is huge. To
Mhm.
me, that is the biggest psychological trap. That is the biggest spiritual warfare anyone
Mhm.
can do, is when you start telling someone that they don't have power and to make them believe that they don't have power.
Whew. Oh man. Thank you for that. And it makes me even think about, in America, we think about Nat Turner Rebellion. We think about Harriet Tubman, who had visions and often attributed to spirit as well. And something, even as I was just doing my own ancestry research, I kind of made a timeline in this country. And that's why I asked you earlier if you felt like there was a spike in interest, because I noticed, particularly in America, all the way back to after enslavement, and we think about Marcus Garvey, like in the early 1900s, and at that time there was a Back to Africa movement, and more Black folks were really thinking about empowerment in a different way, and so we saw the start of the NAACP also at that time. We saw all of these kind of empowerment movements that also coincided with tapping back into African roots. When you fast forward a bit into the 50s and 60s in this country, and we look at the civil rights movement, we had folks like my parents who were walking around with dashikis on, who were learning more about, they were learning Swahili, they were tapping back into our African roots. And I think about right now in this country, I think after, the 60s and the 70s, when our parents were tapping into those roots, what happened? The government sprinkled crack on it. They sprinkled heroin on it. They made, this Herculean effort to suppress it because they saw the power of it. We think about Malcolm X, right? We think about Martin Luther King. All of these are based and spiritual traditions, but also with the connection of the ancestors as well. And so now I'm seeing this come back up I'm seeing as a lot of Black folks, particularly like in our generation, millennials, younger, Gen X, a lot of us are really tapping back into beyond t-shirts that say I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. We're like, no, wait a minute, what does that actually mean? How can we do this actively? And so I'm just curious if you have thoughts about that, like how each time we kind of tap back into our Africanness or stop seeing ourselves as separate, that we are all literally just different stops along the kidnapping trail, but that all of our ancestors, some of the things that still, we look at the food, right? You look at jollof and jambalaya or gumbo, like something carried on, and it wasn't just the food. The traditions are here, the power is still here. And so I guess my last question would be, like I said, any thoughts about that? But then also, any thoughts about anybody that's listening to this right now, what they can start to do to tap into this power if they're feeling nervous, they're feeling afraid, they're thinking people are going to make fun of them. Anything, any advice for the listeners as it relates to this inheritance that we have that so many of us are leaving on the shelf?
Yeah. So going back to the first point about a lot of people being called to this knowledge, I personally believe that it's time. It's just like everything in life goes round in cycles, and something within us is yearning for something more and something authentic. And I think a lot of us have reached a point where we're not prepared to kind of just go along and fake it anymore. Like we just know that, this what they're telling me is it doesn't resonate. So I'm not gonna play, I'm not gonna participate. And I think because of the kind of the technology we have now, which is making it a lot more accessible for people to voice their personal opinions, it's allowing it to become more open. So people can now see that, tapping into your spiritual side is not something to be fearful of, but something that can create personal empowerment. And I think when we're living in a society as well, where we can see that our politicians and things literally don't have our best interests at heart, that our spiritual power becomes even more poignant. And I would even argue that since 2020, there has been an energetic shift. And it's like because of that, it's like the old ways no longer work. So for me personally, unless you're on your spiritual tip, and let me be clear as well, when I say that, I'm not even saying that you have to go down the African spirituality route. I personally feel that whatever spiritual path you choose, as long as you are honoring yourself and, tapping into your intuition and elevating your own direct connection to spirit, then that will help navigate you during this time. So
Mhm.
that would be my advice to anyone. First of all, actually, I feel like if you are not developing yourself spiritually at this point in time, I would say it's important to get in there, because right now, if you don't have a higher perspective from this physical reality and you're locked just mentally on this physical plane, I believe it will cause a lot of mental health issues. I believe it
Mhm.
will cause a lot of stress and just feelings of helplessness. And this is one of the things that I have found so helpful, is that by having my spiritual practice, don't get me wrong, I still have my own mental health issues,
Oh yeah.
but I'm conscious of it at least. Do you know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah.
And this is the thing, and you mentioned this as well, is that, and I saw a post about this recently, I think she was so on point, and she says people who have mental health issues are actually going to fare better than people who don't. Reason being is because people who've had mental health issues have had to actively work through their own stuff and literally work to heal. As you said, whether you're going to see a psychiatrist, whether you're doing your own healing works, whether you're sitting with your emotions, whatever you're doing, those things are so important to help us to progress. Because if you believe everything that our 3D reality shows you, it can take you down some real dangerous mental paths. And I
Mhm.
think having that spiritual connection, for me personally, having that connection with my ancestors, the nature forces, my guides, it's really helped me to be grounded to help me to have a wider perspective on reality and to make me understand that this is just a journey, it's an experience for me to learn, grow, and develop from, and not to necessarily absorb
Mhm.
everything that is happening. And, that is generally a fine line. So, in terms of ways to do that, um, I think sitting with yourself is very important. It's important to be able to have time in solitude. In the world that we live in, everything is
Mhm.
constantly going, everything's constantly on a rush. And I think that act of slowing down, I have to admit, I like being on the internet, but I've had to really reduce some of my time on the internet because I need time for my mind just to be silent for a bit.
Mhm.
And once you kind of allow your mind to be silent, then you allow yourself to kind of tap into a space where you can receive messages. Another thing that I have found really helpful, and this is something that I've more got into recently, and it's what you mentioned as well, is more getting back into my body. And I
Mhm.
feel like this is also the result of healing and the work is that you realize that you've been living outside of your body for ages. And
Yep.
then when you come back in, you're really conscious of your body. So
Mhm.
learning to move your body, stretch your body, allow that energy to shift because we hold so much in our physical vessels. Our bodies literally, even though once again we are here as an individual, Verona sitting here, but I still carry the energy of my ancestors with me in my physical body.
Yep.
So their traumas and things exist. And so
Mhm.
learning to shake that up, to move it out, whether it's through dance or whatever practice you do, whatever somatic movements you do, that is also very important to help create balance and grounding. And I would say whatever spiritual techniques you find useful, for me, definitely I have to be out in nature. Like that's one of the things that I use to balance myself. So bare feet in the ground, I like
Mhm.
to sit and meditate under trees. I have to go to the ocean at least once a year to revitalize my body, and I mean physically immersing myself in the water. And I do visit the river as much as I can because at least that one is a bit more accessible. I can go, but
Mhm.
literally connecting with the elements around us. We are nature, there is no separation. And it's so important that we integrate nature into our lives in our daily experience because that will help to ground us.
Thank you for that. That's what it's all about, is not necessarily, again, telling you all you need to pick a certain practice and follow that. Even, I started studying the Orisha, and I was like, it's 100 and what? Okay. I'm going to go with the ones that called to me. Yemoja was real loud. I was like, all right, that's what we're rolling with. But I also knew that this was really just about being curious, again, being open, being willing to surrender and to go with those feelings that you have, that intuition that you have. If you keep thinking about your ancestors, is for a reason. They want you to connect with them. I feel so when I was talking in the other episodes before this one, I feel so less lonely. I feel like I know that I'm here for a reason. I know about who came before me. There's still so much more to know. This conversation was amazing, but this is very much like just the tip of the iceberg when you start to think about all of the power and possibilities that lie in really understanding who you are. That's what it's about. Who are you? Who came before you? What do you carry with you? And how can you intentionally connect so that when we are in these moments that are coming right now, and this shift that we all feel
Yeah.
that is here right now, that we're able to stay steady. And when we do get knocked off in either direction, that we're able to pull ourselves back into balance and to stay whole in the midst of it all. And so that's why I wanted to do this episode, to start the conversation with you all. Your grandmama and granddad want you to stop being scared of them, and just start off with saying their names. If you have a picture, tell them about your day. If you make something good to eat on their birthday, set it out there for them. I have an all altar. I'll share a picture of it so you all can see, but it can look however you want. And your ancestors will tell you what they want as well. And so thank you so much, Verona. I would love for you just to share where people can find you on social media, and if you have any last thing that you want to say. But
So
other
I
than
can't
that,
believe you said altar, and I didn't mention that as one of the things.
oh,
But yes, setting up an altar. Sorry, I can't believe I missed that one. So yes, you can have a photo, you can have an item that the person had maybe when they were alive that they connected with, or something that's symbolic of their memory. You can add flowers, you can add incense. But once again, as I said, it's your intuition, and I feel it's so important to allow your spirit to guide you. A lot of us kind of go on this journey and be like, am I doing it the right way? And I was like
Mhm.
that as well. But I think it's important to learn to trust yourself. And in terms of initiation, some people feel like they may be called to a particular tradition. And if that is the case, then feel free to go down that road.
Mhm.
But I would say for those who don't want to be initiated, but who just want to kind of tap in or start embracing some of these spiritual teachings, then yes, as I said, the ancestral reverence, really tapping into the elements of nature, because they all have their own messages to pass on and their teaching wisdom. So even as you start to immerse yourself in the water, or lighting a fire, and you can be gazing at it, you can still start receiving information. So it's really about allowing yourself to really embrace that spiritual experience and your whole connection with your environment. And in terms of myself and Ancestral Voices, you can find us at www.ancestralvoices.co.uk, where you can access all of our films, books, documentaries, interviews, events, and everything.
Articles, all the amazing resources and tools. I love it so much. Yeah, for sure.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, say bye, Smokey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Freed Black Girl Podcast. Remember to like, share, subscribe, leave a review, and tell a friend. Sending you much love, good energy, and peace. Until next time.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my